It never fails. There is a topic that I think my audience is going to go gangbusters over and it flops. But then something that I'm really not as excited about does amazing. So proof is that we don't always know what our audience wants, the experience that they want, what they're most excited about that we do, unless we ask. And so today I am talking with Peter Schafer about how to create that perfect poll and survey so that you can learn more about what your audience is looking for so that you can show up for them and get better quality donors, better quality whatever, volunteers, participants. And so I think you're really going to love this episode. I could not stop talking to him, and I think we're going to have him back for another episode later this year, which I'm very excited about. But Peter Schafer is the Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Everest Communications. Everest is a digital communications firm that provides counsel and program execution support to companies in the areas of analytics, social media, strategy, and digital reputation repair. Having worked for prestigious polling organizations such as Gallup and Harris, as well as large global PR firms, Peter is the ideal person to shed light on how using data effectively can vastly improve your digital marketing campaigns. I am so excited about this because Peter believes strongly that context, content, and collaboration are the keys to success in today's competitive digital environment. And he wants to share his insight with you all to enable you to start building better digital strategies that will not only work, but will exceed your expectations. Now, here's the thing. We are talking about polls and strategies around that in this episode, but this can be used for so many things outside of just your digital marketing strategy. So I hope that you'll take a listen and really think about maybe 1 or 2 times that you can survey your audience, or maybe it's multiple times that you're surveying your audience, but one's only your donors and one's only your volunteers or your event attendees, or just your general email list. And what information can you glean? But what I also love about this is really getting real with ourselves. So when the results come in, how do we interpret them and how do we use them and how do we trust them? Those are all kind of the topics that we talk about in this episode. So make sure you give it a listen and let me know if you're going to run a poll or survey your audience, because I really think you should. But before we get into it, this episode is brought to you by our digital marketing therapy sessions. I hope that you'll head on over to thefirstclick.net/office hours. I am here for you. If you are thinking about digital marketing strategies going into the second half of the year, and you just want to know if it's kind of in line with what you're thinking, or you want to do a survey, but you have so many things you want to do and you're just not sure how to go about it, that's what these sessions are here for. Thefirstclick.net/office hours. Book your 30-minute session today. Let's get into the episode. You're listening to the Digital Marketing Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Sammy Bedell-Mulhern, and each week I bring you tips from myself and other experts, as well as hot seats with small business owners and entrepreneurs to demystify digital marketing and get you on your way to generating more leads and growing your business. Hey everybody, please join me in welcoming Peter Schafer to the podcast. Peter, thanks for joining me today.
Sammy, it's great to join you. Thank you so much.
So we talk a lot about data and like how to find data when we're trying to make marketing decisions like analytics or social media demographics, but there's something that's just super special about like just talking to our existing audience. So why is polling our audience or pulling data from our existing customers and donors something that you are so passionate about?
Well, for 2 particular reasons. One is I think more and more leaders are becoming comfortable and are embracing data as an asset. So they're looking at it differently. They're talking about it differently. They're digging into it more deeply. And I think that just the funness of seeing what comes out of that has really invigorated this whole area of polling and research, and even the reemergence of focus groups. Nobody would have thought that they would have come back, and now that they are. The second is that I think the information sharing among recipients or donors or whatever has become so much more robust. It used to be kind of, we'll ask a question, you give us an answer, and it was a one-way transaction. And now with both the way questions are asked, but also the technology, you can have a discussion even within a poll where you wouldn't have been able to do that 10 years ago. And I think that's allowed for a lot more conversational information sharing, but also a higher quality of data being shared. And so that's exciting. That's been the fun part, is that there's been this upgrade in quality of the data.
Well, and I think there's two things that people say often. If you go to your leadership and you say, okay, I want to poll our donors, I feel like there's 2 points of pushback. First one being, oh no, if we poll our audience, then we're going to look like we don't know what we're doing if we're asking them for their opinion. And then number 2 is, well, we don't have a big enough audience to get enough information that would be valuable, or we have too big of an audience, it would be way too much work. So 2 questions on that. Like, one, how would you contradict that leadership question of our audience is going to think we're incapable? And 2, like, how many people do you really need to poll to get good numbers?
Yeah, the second one's a great question, and we'll get to that in a second. What I tell most of the leadership teams that I work with on this particular topic is that, number one, their audiences are changing almost every day. They may not necessarily change their values. They may not necessarily change, their philosophy or approach to life. But there's so many stimulus that they're hitting or getting every day, that they are adapting and changing their opinions or minds about things. So that a snapshot in time is not a movie, let's say. So I say that your audience is changing, and the fact that you recognize that their needs are changing actually shows that you're ahead of things versus behind things. The second that I've noticed, and I talk about this with leadership teams all the time, is that you can ask about the same topic using different types of questions. So you can, so that you're able to gather and build out the data by asking those different questions. So it's not like you're going back and asking the same thing over and over and over. And I think audiences, and especially donor audiences that I've seen, really, really appreciate that, because they feel like they're included in something and that they're building on something versus, are you going to give to us this month or next month, or does this theme work for the campaign, that kind of thing.
They're part of the project.
That's exactly right. They now feel like they have a different level of ownership. I was working with a small liberal arts college a couple months ago on this very thing, and they really, they took their statistics 101 class way too seriously and started doing all this thing, and tried to do a lot of cutting and pasting. And I said, no, this really is simple. What you just need to do is engage, use interesting questions and probing questions to engage them, and then go back a second time and ask for clarification, and you'll get even better responses. To your point about the number of people that you need to poll, if you're doing a finite set of people, so let's say that you only have 200 donors, or that your group is, the typical rule of thumb is that if you're able to get at least 25% of that 200, so if you're able to get 50, that's a reasonable set of data to use and work with. And it may not necessarily be representative, but it's actually usable for what what your research is supposed to do. In public polls and large public polls, the number of people who have been participating in those has been dropping. In private polling or something that's much more targeted, those levels have stayed pretty much the same, if not increased a little bit. So if you're looking at something that the Wall Street Journal does, or Gallup poll does, who I used to work with, or Harris, they're looking at sample sizes of 750 to 1,000 to, even bigger than that. But they're also contacting almost 50 to 60,000 people to just get those 1,000. So it's the numbers begin to get exponential, and it becomes cost ineffective to do.
Well, I might be completely wrong. So since you work for Gallup, you have to let me know. But I want to say, like, sometimes Gallup polls will even run off of 100 people, and that's enough for them to extrapolate kind of what the general public is thinking.
Yeah. Yes.
So and 100 people versus the population of the U.S., like, that's a very small sample size.
Yeah. And one of the things that has happened in the evolution of this, Sammy, is that we now have more data points on people to start with before we even go into the field.
Yeah.
So we don't have to ask all those demographic questions. We don't have to ask a lot of the things that used to, but we're able to then take that and there's a term in survey and polling work that's about incidence in the population. So for example, moms represent 23% of the overall population. We can narrow down that field just by some of the data that we already have and not have to ask the question again or
Yep.
bug them about those types of things. That allows us to narrow down the sample set so that we do have really a very tight, but also a very representative audience because of that.
Okay, so the most important part before you poll, I would guess, is understanding what the goal is of that poll,
Yes.
right? Because
Yes.
we want to make sure that what we're looking for, we're not giving them 100 questions to try to get all the data, right? We might poll our audience 2 or 3 times a year, but each one has that very specific topic, right?
Yes. Yep. Yes. And that you've nailed it. The poll has to be outcomes driven, meaning number one is, what do we really want to find out? Is it directional data? Is it specific transactional data? Is it intention data? Are you going to give or not? That kind of thing. But the second is that how are we going to use the data? What is it that we're going to make? What decisions do we want to make off of this? And I think that's where we kind of get stumbled around. And then to your point, because everybody has a different opinion about it, we now end up with a salad bowl poll, which has got every vegetable and everything, and you mix it all up, and it's now it's become a 100-question survey, and nobody wants to take it. Interestingly enough, one of the things that has changed in the polling community because of the technology is that a lot of surveys are now less than 12 minutes versus even 10 or 12 years ago, the standard was about 18 minutes. So we know
that's
now
time it
that
takes you to complete the survey.
Time it takes you to complete. The second dynamic is this, and about 50% of all polls, online polls, are taken on a mobile device, not your PC. So you need to make sure that the questions are recognizable enough on a small screen, because you can just point. So you've got this, you've got this kind of dual dynamic of compression and also, just we need to speed through it. And I think that has intimidated a number of people from asking. They want to ask the academic question versus the question they really need the answer to, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And it kind of is taking me back to, like, we coach people on when they're writing their blog content, when they're writing their social media content, like, you want to write at a 4th grade level, not because that is the academic level of the people or the cognitive ability of the people that are doing it. But like you said, we want to get them through quickly, and we want them to be able to scan, process, and answer quickly. So would you say something like that is similar when you're crafting your surveys?
Yeah, exactly right. And the 2 cautions I would do, or I would say to everybody, is this. Number one is that conversational questions are more effective than the, on the scale of 1 to 10 with this and that. And, if Mars happened to align with Earth at the same time, don't put too many conditions into the question. Just ask it as quickly as possible. The other thing too, and this is a little bit of a difference, is that if you form the question as an I statement, like I support this versus do you support this? Do you support that's binary? If you say I support this, you can scale that to be 0 to 5 or 0 to 10 and get a measure of intensity or even a measure of frequency about it. And then we've seen it, and this was in research that Gallup did and some work that Harris Poll did as well, that those I statements create an ownership from a respondent or a donor that a question does not. So if you say, please rate the following, it's like, yes, I plan to give in 2022. Yes, you are in my estate planning process, that kind of thing. Those are statements that people can own versus, would you be interested in estate planning? That kind of thing. So,
well, and wouldn't a better question be more, because you're pulling on the emotional piece, right? Like, I'm now invested in what it is that you're talking about. So wouldn't better questions be something like, I would be interested in giving to the after school program, or I would be interested in giving to the nutritional education program, like so that you can get more data on specific things that your organization is doing versus kind of those broad, like how specific do you want your questions to be?
I think you want to kind of think about it in a pyramid or at least a funnel. Is that if you are going to ask about, let's say, programmatic things, you might want to start out with a broad general statement about the programmatic things that the organization wants to do, and are you generally supportive of that, or yes, these are important to me. There's that the important scale of somewhat important to very important is always one of the a better metric. And then you might ask an intermediary question and then say, here are a list of programs that we now have and we're currently considering. Would are these of interest to you? And then you can kind of get that narrowed down. That three-pronged approach typically helps if you are working on either a marketing or a campaign, a donation campaign, capital campaign, because it allows you to start at the broad and then get down to the specific. When you're looking at the results, though, you flip it and you look at the specific down to the broad, and does it connect? So it's almost like you turn the funnel upside down in terms of your data analysis. But it's a very easy way to funnel people's interest into into those topics pretty quickly. One note on this, though, and I get this question a lot, the inherent bias in these questions is a lot less of an issue than it was 20 years ago, because number one, almost everybody is taking surveys. They understand kind of the dynamic. They're exposed to this all the time. So there's a lot less inherent bias in it, simply because people are much more aware of it. The second is that especially for marketing and for donor campaigns and other not-for-profit type research, it is much better to have a little bias in it, simply because you already know that group is predisposed to be part of your audience.
It's a warm audience.
So exactly. That's exactly right. It's a warm audience. So you actually want, because they're captive, you want to ask them more specific questions, because they will give you much more specific answers, which will help create better programming, create better results for the survey, will give you better directional data in regard to what's the next step strategically. So I wouldn't be concerned about that.
That's a really good point. I think that's a really good point. And I want to jump back to kind of what you said at the beginning about like having, yes, you want to know what your goals are and all of that. So when you come to crafting your survey, do you think it's best to start kind of at the results side and then reverse engineer your survey to like the questions that you're asking, so that you make sure everything is leading back to that end goal?
Yeah, there's two. Ultimately a lot of methods, but yes, what you want to do in one regard is reverse engineer. And one exercise that we used to have people go through a lot when I was working on the Gallup poll and also the Harris poll was to have the client think about what headline they would like to see on the front page of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or some major news outlet. Was it going to be on Time magazine or when it was still in print, that kind of thing. That helped kind of start to define, and then we would say, okay, such and such has cured hunger. Do you want a specific percentage that says something like that 62% of the American population supports our effort to cure hunger, or so you begin to kind of piece it together to say, okay, here's generally what we'd like to see, here's what we would specifically like to say, and then we build the questions around to get to those answers. And that's, I think, it's a good creative method that almost everybody can employ and not have to hire consultants and things like that, because it's something that is it just resonates because everybody's looking at media all the time. And you could, but the other thing too, and to your point about the, just being the reverse engineering part of it, is just being aware of the barriers. If you get to a point where you really don't know what the outcome is, and we're just doing this because we've done it every year or something like that, that's kind of that red flag to challenge yourself to either say, okay, is this really going to be valuable? Do we really need to do this? Or if we did it differently, what would we hope to get the outcome to be? And I worked with this happened I guess probably about 6 months ago. I worked with a not-for-profit, that they have to report to their board these survey results. So it's become kind of one of this very tedious and, we don't like to do it and blah, blah, blah. And I said, why don't we just do this? Let's do 80% for what the board wants, but use the other 20% for your strategic directional look forward, that kind of thing. And everybody's like, well, we can do that. And I'm like, well, unless you're asking it like a 25-minute survey, sure, why not? But again, it just don't get locked into the, we've got to do this again, or we have this trend question that we've used for 20 years. I tell people a lot of times, think about who was president 20 years ago. I mean, think about the audiences that that you have added or subtracted in that amount of time. So, don't be beholden to a trend that is not going to necessarily give you the information you need.
Yeah. Well, and I think also, so crafting the questions to get the results, you're not like trying to manipulate the results by any means, but what happens and how do you handle when those results come back? Because I think a lot of times with nonprofit organizations, we are so emotionally invested in them ourselves. We are so emotionally invested in the product and the project. We think everybody else cares about it. We think everybody cares about it in the way that we care about it. So sometimes those surveys go out and the feedback we get is maybe not what we were expecting and or wanting. So kind of any thoughts around how to wrap your head around results that you've gotten that maybe weren't ideal and how to kind of use those to, because it could be a whole host of things, right? It could be you're talking to the wrong people. It could be that you just frame the questions wrong. Like, how do you go about processing all of that?
Yeah, so it's a really good point that you mentioned about kind of the forensic process of, did this go the way we wanted it to go? Did it, was the fielding time enough? Was it, did we get to talk to the right people? Was it the flamethrowers, the ones that always give us the ones? Were they the, certainly going through that forensic process. The two things that I usually tell clients to do, number one is pull together 4 or 5 people and just that are not as attached to it and that but are still engaged and emotional about it, and just run the results by them and see if they and usually that little focus group or that little triad or whatever will give you some good feedback that you hadn't been able to pick up in the data itself. One of the things that and this is an old methodology, but it's still pretty relevant today, is that when big surveys used to get done, it was qualitative, quantitative, qualitative. So and I think a lot of people had dropped off that qualitative part, and so I recommend it because it's a good, it's just a good, gut check. The second is that besides doing the forensic process, would be to go back and then look at demographic groups to see if the data is consistent with those demographic groups, or I should say psychographic groups.
Yeah.
So so I'll give you an example. So if you have within that set of data donors that have given for 10 plus years, and that might be a good group to isolate to see if their results are different than the rest of the results. And if they're not, because you would assume that they would be engaged up to
at a higher level,
right? So they're groupings of your donor base that probably are better or more representative of the group, and just pull those people out, look at that group and compare them to the rest of the data. And that usually will give you some, how far away or how close you are actually to the data points you want to be. It doesn't, especially with some of the software today, it's not that difficult to do. But it is an exercise that I think is a good test to see or sort out what these anomalies in the data would be. I would say this: if you let's say that you're sending it to survey to 500 people, you get 250 back. If you have a question that has less than 40 responses, particular, I would probably kick that data out, and just because at that point you only have 20% of the actual participants, but realistically you only have 8% of the entire universe, and that's just not enough.
Yeah.
And so anything, I would say anything that is below, probably a 10 to 15% threshold of I would just kind of, it might be interesting to know, but I wouldn't be, spending $1 million
Don't
based on
change
that
your
result.
entire marketing plan based off of those 15 people.
That's exactly right.
But
Yes.
I love that you said that, because I think that that's a decision that I have been a part of so many organizations where the one board member who happens to give a lot of money shows up and says, hey, we got to do this because I heard that this is the thing to do. And then you shift your whole strategy, but it doesn't make sense to the goals of what you're trying to accomplish. And these survey results are almost similar, right? Like you want to make sure that you're not just making decisions based off of one small handful of people.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Sammy. And so many people have different interpretations of what the numbers mean, and I think sometimes we get either too lost in the significance of what the number we think is saying. So for example, we would do a lot of political polling, a lot of issue polling, and I tell this story. When I was working at Gallup right after the Bush-Gore election of 2000, we did subsequent polls on trust in the Supreme Court. And at the beginning of that process, 61% trust. At the end of that process, with the hanging chads in the Florida election, the recount, and they decided it was still 61%. Underneath it, all of the data had changed, but it was still, at the aggregate, it was 61. So to your point, sometimes you need to go back to that board member and say, well, you know what? Yeah, it says 62%, but underneath it, this, and this.
There's some issues we might need to take a look at.
Yeah. And I think, was it the focus group of one is, you have to account for it to a certain degree, but you're right. I mean, it's easy to toss out data results if you don't like them, because it's, and I think having that discipline, having that rigor, having that, open-minded approach at the outset to say, hey, look, we know that we're asking some tough questions. We know we're asking some things that we may not want to actually find out. But that's okay. And we're comfortable with that because this is what we need to do.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you kind of what questions we should ask and what questions we shouldn't ask, but I feel like that's so dependent on the purpose behind your poll. So instead, I want to flip that and ask, like, how should we ask the question? So you already mentioned I statements, like making people emotional, but is there kind of that mix of the scale questions versus open-ended versus multiple choice? Like, kind of how might we want to craft this in order to make sure we get the most impact and still make it short and sweet?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I these are not hard and fast, but they are at least guidelines for what we in terms of market research and what helps completion rates go on. For the most part, if you can offer scaled questions or scaled statements on either 1 to 5 or a 1 to 10 scale, that's probably the best way to go.
Okay.
Most people are used to, so it's like it's very easy, they can do. If you have a complex question where you need multiple answers, so I'll use this one, which subscription streaming services do you have?
Yep.
List is up. Usually 12 is where you need to stop.
Oh, wow. That's more than I would have expected.
Yeah. 12 is usually the limit. But again, that if you have a list like that, either put it in a grid or make it, but 12 is usually and of course have other so they can fill it in.
Right.
One of the things for open ends is this. Typically, we recommend 1 to 3 open ends per survey. Unless you tell the respondent or the donor or whomever you're surveying up front that we want you to elaborate on each of the points that we do. And at that point, then you keep the survey to about 8 to 10 questions, but you know that you're going to get an open end at the end of each question. So actually you now have 20 questions, but the 20 questions are 10 rate, and then why did you rate it this way? 10 rate, why did you rate it this way? So that I mean, and again, that 20 questions would be about a 6-minute survey with them typing in.
Well, I feel like that's two-sided. Like, number one, you're asking the surveyor to do more work when you have more open-ended questions, but you're also then requiring yourself to do more work because to process all of that information is going to take you and your team a whole lot longer.
Yeah, it is. I mean, if the there's a good news there. I mean, there are software packages like word clouding things that you can drop the verbatims into, and it spits out some really nice graphics and kind of gives you, what the frequency and the variance. Some packages have a little bit of sentiment analysis in it, so that they can, but it's still very rudimentary science. So I would caution everybody before, it's but on those particular questions, like I said, on a normal survey, 1 to 3 is usually the limit.
Yeah.
And typically they're used at the end, not the beginning.
Of course.
Obviously, but and that's usually the kind of the cadence is that you can get through about 30 questions in about 7 to 8 minutes, and with pretty much ease. The one thing that I would also suggest to you in terms of when you're using scaling, if you just need kind of a disagree or disagree scale, a 5-point scale is perfectly fine.
Yeah.
If you need to look at intensity, how people are really, usually 1 to 10 scales or 1 to 7 scales are better at that, because you can have larger extremes. So it is, for example, it's easier to say somebody who rated, or we got an 8.2 on this question. That's different than a 6.8. There's a statistical difference there.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit harder to say 3.2 versus 3.6, if that makes sense.
So would it be kind of like, hey, how would you rate our customer service on a scale of 1 to 5 versus how likely are you to send your child to our after school program? That might be a 1 to 10, because that's a statistics you're probably going to want to share a little bit more publicly with your audience.
That's right. That's right. And the other thing too is that the 1 to 10 scale gives you a little more flexibility in regards to the buckets that you're looking at. So, like you mentioned, likelihood is always it's a typical question. Once you get above 6 on likelihood, that's a pretty good indicator of intent. That's, if they're, in that 3 to 4 to 5 range, that's kind of like, oh, well, maybe. But once you, and I think that that's helpful for you all, because then it's saying, okay, we probably have a little bit more distance to convince them, or a little bit more distance to sweeten the offer or change the marketing a little bit, but at least that there's an intent there that didn't exist. So
yeah. Okay. So I have 2 questions left, because I know we've gone through a lot of things and given people a lot of things to think about. But number one, the second to last question I want to ask you is anonymity of surveys and polls versus asking people for their contact information, and then kind of pairing that with incentivizing people for completing the result or completing the survey in order to get more results. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely. Let me do the anonymous first. Privacy is a big issue for most people. I find that, though, in not-for-profit settings, it's a little less intrusive than in other places, and there's usually a more gentle or gentler ask than in kind of getting an anonymous email or something like that. It's always a good practice to say, if you have any questions about this, here's a contact person. They can clear up any questions, that kind of thing. But it is perfectly fine to ask to be recontact, to ask for a recontact opportunity at some point.
Would you recommend that just be an optional thing? So those that want, okay, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's totally optional. Usually it's at the end. Usually it's not, it's either, name, email, phone, whatever, or whatever the best way is to reach them. Typically, interestingly enough, about 40% of people will say they want to be recontacted at the end. So I think, again, that practice is fine. If there is something that is sensitive, that, for example, you would have some issue in regard to privacy, or that you're going to such a small donor audience that it could be possible to figure out who's saying what, I would say make it as confidential as you can. Yeah. But the larger you get, the better option is. Incentivization is really it's a tough question to ask these days, or it's a tough question to address these days. Number one is nonprofits have very limited budgets, so they're not going to be able to do elaborate incentives. And then sometimes even offering the incentive sends a mixed signal like, oh, well, if you can do this, then that, typically for those types of surveys, either we will make a donation or we will give you an option to make a donation, or have your name associated with this list of people, or it would be some special incentive related to the not-for-profit, like you would be eligible to win 2 tickets for our
Gala or
event.
yeah.
Exactly. And typically that can either be done by a sweepstakes or done by a raffle. So when all the participants have finished, you randomize them, you pick one, and that's the winner.
But you could even find somebody who's as data driven that's a sponsor and say, hey, what if we say for every survey result that comes in, you'll match $1, you'll give $1 donation. So then people know if they turn it in, they're going to automatically make a contribution to your
exactly right. And those are totally within reason. They're certainly totally within common practice. Where the incentive process gets a little dicey is most people want an immediate response for that incentive. So if you complete the survey, they want their gift card within 24 hours of that kind of thing. So I just have to be careful about it. I won't name the organization, but they are not for profit, and they asked me to do something for them, and it was a $10 Amazon card. It took me an hour just to activate the code and all this other stuff. It became a distance set. Now I still am giving to the organization, but you want to make sure that yeah. So, but what I have found is that the incentives, they help, but they are not they're not the main driver for why somebody participates. So, it's a help, but it's not a requirement.
Well, I just want to throw out there, if you're asking for testimonials on like Google or any other of the platforms as part of it, and you incentivize it, that can also get you in trouble. So just keep that in mind. If that's part of your survey process, don't do that. Very true. Okay, the last question that I have for you is software. So people might be listening to this and they might be like, okay, this all sounds well and good, but like we have no way of like pulling this together. There's so many tools out there that are free or cost effective. So kind of what are your favorite survey tools in the digital space?
Oh, that's
a lot. And I can share mine if you don't want to get yourself into trouble.
Well, I tell you, so 2 things on that before I start naming names. Number one is that you're right. There is a ton of software out there. And that if there's actually even a subset of software, if you have your list and that's all you're going to use, you have your email list, that you can use it for free, and it's great. I don't have a particular favorite. I work with clients who work with SurveyMonkey, work with Survey Gizmo, work with Taluna, work with Suzy, work with you kind of, I hate to say swing it, you could swing a bat and hit a survey.
Oh, you're naming them I've never even heard of.
Yeah. But the one thing that I would say is this, this is especially true in some of the education clients that I've worked with, is that number one, that some of the software that they already use have survey modules built into them. So it's kind of one of those toss-ins that actually, if you did a little bit of digging, you might be able to get some good value out of it. Yeah. So on that. But the second thing that strikes me is this: there are a lot of software packages that are specifically for not-for-profits, that I think in one regard make it harder for you all to complete surveys, because it doesn't give you the flexibility to be, especially on the analytics package, to do some other things around it. So I would just say, one, when you're selecting it, there are 2 criteria. One is how easy it is to actually program it, the survey, and launch it. But the second is, what kind of analytics package is on the back end? I don't need to have this, gargantuan MIT built system. So that's what I would look at too. And the ones that I just mentioned, from SurveyMonkey to Survey Gizmo or whatever, they all have statistical packages built into them that are used by market researchers and Fortune 500 companies and other groups. Right. So that, these are the, right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I would throw out there too, a lot of times nonprofits have a CRM that they're using that has a ton of stuff in it that they're not even taking advantage of. So that's always my go-to. Talk to your CRM. Even if it's not something you can see on your dashboard, they might have that as an easy add-on build-in. if you're doing very simple surveys, I think Google Forms are great. They're easy.
Yes.
And they will export to an Excel document. To your point,
Yep.
they don't have the back-end machine learning kind of, or not machine learning, but like data pull. But I think it's important to take a look at the goal of your survey, and then kind of do the research on the platform that makes the most sense. Because when you, like you said, when you start to Google how to take surveys, it can be overwhelming. And if you don't know what you need it to do, then you're going to like get lost in a sea of features and benefits and companies.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, it's so fragmented these days that it's not easy to kind of navigate. And each of these companies is also transforming right now into different types of things. So when Qualtrics, which used to be, a very, very great platform to use, now they've changed their business model because they're public, and they don't have as many free services or free tools. So It has changed a lot.
Yeah. Well, as you know, nonprofits, TechSoup is a great place to go to find out those tech tools that have the nonprofit discounts as well. So make sure you check that out. I feel like we could talk about this forever, and we may need to have you come back for another episode to talk more about the psychology of questions, because I
would love that.
That is something we didn't dive too deep into today, but I think is super helpful. But is there any kind of last takeaway, Peter, that you might want to share with folks as they're kind of starting to think about and craft their polls for their audience?
The only takeaway I would have is this. And this has been an evolution just across the last 5 years. I have noticed that conversational questions, almost like what we're talking about here, are actually one of the best ways to start building your question for a survey. And that if you start writing those down, it's almost as if you can start building what you think the responses are in a way. And I would challenge everybody to not over engineer these surveys and not make them more complex than they need to be. And to your point is just to say, we're committed to using the outcomes, regardless of whether it's good, bad, or ugly. But we're open to at least accepting that that's the case. And I think, most people, they hear survey and it's like, oh my gosh, we got to do this and we got to do this and it's got to be this pristine. And, in a lot of cases, it doesn't. It just has to be good enough to make a good decision.
That's a really great spot to end this. Peter, how do people find out more about you and learn more from you?
The best way is to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm at Peter Schafer on LinkedIn. And my email is peter@everest, EVERESTCOMMS.com.
Awesome. Well, and we'll link all of this up at the show notes, thefirstclick.net/160. So we'll have all of the resources in there as well. You can check that out. Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. I really had a great time.
Yeah. Thank you so much to Peter again for joining me on this episode. You can find all the resources and things that we chatted about in the show notes at thefirstclick.net/160. But I hope that you will like and subscribe wherever you listen, even if that's on YouTube, because yes, we are on YouTube at thefirstclick.net/YouTube. But thank you so much for listening. And I cannot wait to see the surveys that you create. Let me know how the results come in and if we can support you in your digital marketing strategies to support that. But for now, I'll see you in the next one.